Shawn's Extension, Soybean, and Small Grains Agronomist and Professor in UW-Madison Department of Plant and Agroecosystem Sciences. Today, Shawn is going to share what he's seeing with wheat harvest and soybean development so far in 2024. Thank you, Shawn, for joining us.
Awesome. Thanks, Josh. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. So what I really want to kind of do is give us a quick walkthrough of what we saw, and kind of the reason I have this weird title is kind of comparing to what we had last year, where we were kind of still in a drought, a flash drought last year at this point, and now where we are in terms of the precipitation this year. So real quick here is that they're trying to looking at some of our performance trials. So these are our preliminary results. We just got done combining yesterday. So just to kind of give everyone an idea of what we saw. And to be honest, I was actually pleasantly surprised by the wheat yields we saw at Arlington. We had about 95 bushels per acre, Random Lake 97 bushels per acre, and Waterloo 94. Fond du Lac, we were at 80 bushels per acre. And we've seen a lot of significant rainfall at that location. So I'm guessing a lot of that was having to do with saturated soils. We actually had a pretty thin stand given that amount of rainfall and those yields. As expected, though, our test weights were really low. I'm sure many of our farmers had experienced some of that across the state. These are generally low for us. I've actually heard some areas of state have like sub 50 test weight, which is extremely low, and some of the dockage would be pretty significant in those cases. In terms of disease performance, I'm really thankful we have Damon Smith and his crew goes out and does an excellent job of rating all of our locations for us, and that data will be provided here shortly. We expect to have the Excel spreadsheets up by the end of this week, with the data and the PDF coming out next week, but all of our disease ratings will be available in both of those formats. At our Arlington location that we see here, we had a pretty significant amount of both Fusarium head blight. We see in this picture head scab, which would be at a point where we would see yield limiting numbers and amounts, as well as stripe rust. So we had some pretty significant stripe rust at this location as well. At our Waterloo site, we did see some Fusarium head blight as well. We can see from these images down here. And we did have a touch of hail come through that we took some estimates in terms of what we saw for yield loss. We think we lost about 2 to 3 bushels per acre of yield loss at our Waterloo location, but it was pretty consistent across the entire trial. And this is kind of a good example of what we saw when we went out there, took our measurements, and this is right at harvest, where we can see some of that volunteer wheat coming through. A couple things that we learned. I did get contacted from a farmer from Sheboygan County, and he had noticed something interesting on his weigh ticket, where he had actually had an assessment for Don, or Fusarium head blight, given from the elevator. So I might just have Damon, if he wants to pop on here and make a comment about that. I guess if I was a farmer, I would really ask hard questions from those elevators that were pulling these subsamples for Fusarium head blight and getting Don numbers, asking what kind of tests they were, where were they run, the sampling procedure, in case you did get some type of significant dockage. I don't know. Damon, are you available to chat about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure, Shawn. I would definitely ask some questions about how the tests are done. I can tell you, in our own lab, we're pretty intentional about how we grind samples and then actually do those types of tests. So we actually have a completely separate facility that's in a different building that we actually grind grain samples, and that's purposeful because you get a lot of dust movement and you can have cross contamination with very sensitive assays. So you want to be careful. I think first off, just ask some questions about where the grinding's being done, and then where the assays are being done, and those really should be in at least separate rooms, in my opinion. The other thing that you need to know too is these are rapid tests, which are different from some of the tests. Like if you submitted a sample to one of the commercial labs in the state, or sent it to a university, we would use different technologies, chemistry-based type tools to actually look at what's actually in the sample. So those tests are a little bit different than what we might use now at the university. So that's the second piece. And then the third, which is is probably the most debatable, and there are standards out there, but it's still debated heavily, is how do we actually pull a sample, right? And you can have hot spots in a load of grain. You can miss those hot spots. You can land right in the middle of a hot spot. Our workaround is to sample a lot and frequently. And unfortunately, I think this year, given the spotty nature, I think, of both the head blight and straight rust epidemics across the state, testing and knowing what you have before you carry it to the elevator, I think is helpful, right? Know what you got. And I do know there's several commercial labs. Our A3646 publication indicates some labs that'll actually do some mycotoxin testing. So, you can send those off on your own, get your own independent mycotoxin analysis, and then what you're carrying to the facility if you can do that. So I would say just be cautious, ask good questions, and then if you can, know before you go, so that you're sure you're carrying reasonably clean grain to the elevator.
Cool. Thanks, Damon. And a couple final notes in terms on the wheat side of things is, if you are going to be saving grain, I would just be cautious not to be saving any grain from fields or varieties that had a pretty significant level of incidence and severity if you serve head blight or scab. And this would be a good thing to check in our book that Damon's group did some really good job of rating those, both the Waterloo site and Arlington. You can check your variety against ours just to see how susceptible they are. But just to have a note of how clean that grain is when you pull it out, and you can look for those scabby or tombstone kernels. Secondly, I did get a lot of phone calls as well. But given the wet weather we've had, some challenges getting the crop to dry down, that there were some glyphosate applications made, not just in soft red winter wheat, but also in oat, as we're getting ready to start cutting oats here. In the next couple of weeks, some questions about that. So remember, if you are saving seed, or if you're certified seed grower, do not be saving any seed out of a field that had been sprayed glyphosate, as that will significantly decrease the germ of next year's seed crops. Just couple quick notes on this. So be looking for those results hopefully by the end of the day on Friday, and we can get this out to you so you can start pre-planting for the 2024-2025 growing season. All right. Now, in general, I'm not telling people here on terms of the soybean side something you don't know, but we did see lots of variability in terms of our planting dates, and lots of replanting and replanting. There's been some fields that were replanted 3 times. That means they actually been planted 4 times. One of the things here from this data that we've seen over the last few years is you get a lot of options, specifically as you move later into the growing season, in terms of what your maturity group can be and how well it performs. So I guess the point I'm making here is, if we're getting into some light replants, and I know any of the double crop beans would have gone in by now, I would expect, but you get a pretty wide range in how well those maturity groups perform at these later planting dates. And to be honest and fair, it's a pretty wide maturity group range. So you don't really need to get uberly focused on what maturity group you plant in these late planting situations. Also, as a friendly reminder, and again, I know it's a little late, but I always like to bring this up, as we had some questions from industry out there. Basically, my threshold for doing anything in a stand, if it's been planted prior to, let's say May 10th or earlier, is 50,000 plants per acre. If your stand is 50,000 plants per acre and relatively evenly distributed, I know there's wet spots, obviously, that have 0 stand. That's an automatic go in and fill in those areas. But if it's 50,000 or greater, I don't even touch that stand. Our data here shows you might get 2 bushels back, and given $10 local grain prices we see today, even if you get free seed, it's really hard to go in and replant a stand 50,000 or greater and see an economic gain for that. So this is something to think about and put in the back of your head for next year. We did see a lot of issues here. If you look, this is a video that we got from southern Wisconsin where we had a weird problem. We actually had millipedes causing a significant damage to soybean. Again, this was a heavy no-till corn residue situation. So at first they thought it was slugs, what you see right there, but we had a pretty significant high level of millipedes. Again, there's really no pesticides, insecticides labeled for millipedes, but it's just been an odd year for how wet it's been that there are other things out there working. In terms of cover crops, we did see a significant amount of biomass for cover crops this growing season, which kind of led to some of these wetter soils planting in, especially the rainfall we had, having some challenges with closing that furrow. And sometimes, soybean is a little bit more forgiving, but we did see with that open furrow slot, slugs actually moving down that furrow line and causing some pretty significant damage. So just some things that we noticed. So we've had 2 years of extremes. Last year in 2023, we had some cover crops that we terminated late on purpose. And in those situations, we had such a lack of rainfall that our seed sat in the ground for 2.5, 3 weeks before we actually got a rainfall enough to germinate it. This year is the opposite side. So again, just to be clear, I'm not ripping on cover crops. I think they have a place, and I'll kind of talk about those in a little bit, but just understand that when we're moving into these cover crop situations, they are going to take some increased management, as many of you know, but just to be aware of some of the additional challenges we have in these cover crop systems. So this is actually a pretty cool graphic, one of my postdocs, Tosh, put together. And what we did is we basically collected soil samples from 21 long-term cropping system trials across the United States. And a couple of things we found that were pretty interesting, these long-term trials. One is that anytime we had 2 or more crops in a rotation over a long period of time, we would actually saw greater soil test phosphorus in those situations where we had multiple crops versus, let's say, continuous corn in that situation or continuous soybean. Another interesting thing is that we didn't have a ton of artificial drain sites across the country, but where we did have artificial drainage in these studies, we did not see any artificial drainage linked with any of our soil health indicators. And I think what we're seeing here, and I think most of us understand that, is that these drainage lines only run depending on the year for a few weeks out of the year, and maybe just having them running for 4 weeks or 5 weeks out of a 52-week year isn't enough to really influence our soil health indicators. So that's good in that it didn't influence them positively or negatively. The one cool thing that came out of this is we were able to sample some of our cover crop trials where we had cover crops continuously on the landscape for 5+ years. So this same field had cover crops for 5+ years. And we did see greater mineralizable carbon in those plots and greater water extractable organic carbon. So basically what we're seeing is in these long-term cover crop systems, we are seeing an increase in carbon. So that is a pretty cool thing that we're able to capture even after a short period of time, which is roughly 5 years in a lot of these trials. So stay tuned for more information as we pull that out and send it out to everybody. Again, we had a lot of flooding, so we get this question every single year. So one thing that we did, because we were able to get our drone funded half by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board and half by the Wisconsin Corn Growers Association, we were able to actually go in and put in some plots. And on the right-hand side here, we can see some stands that were reduced because of flooding, short-term flooding, where they would have been underwater or saturated for about 48 to 36 hours, where we didn't necessarily totally kill the stand out. And we went in with about 100 pounds of urea, which is 50 pounds of N, just flew down with the drone just to see, are we able to basically carry that soybean into or over this hump threshold where we can actually get some growth, promote that plant to, put some biomass out there and get us to the point where we can go back into a biologically end fixation. So for those of you that aren't really remember this point, basically it takes 7 to 10 days after we get past a saturated soil where there's no oxygen in the soil for new biological end fixation to occur. So this is just a mechanism for us to try and just look at that and see if there's anything a farmer can do specifically in these critical growth periods. We'll do some economics on this as well, just to kind of let you know where we're at with this. So there are some cool things we can do with these drones, as many of you will know. And actually, we're working with Damon Smith. John Gaska was out spraying this morning. We just finished 5 of our locations for putting white mold applications out with the drone. And John's going to go spray corn this afternoon, which is research funded by Wisconsin Corn Growers Association in collaboration with Damon Smith here to kind of look at hybrid performance with some of these. And I'll let Damon talk more about this. Now, the cool thing we did with Damon last year was we kind of look at this comparison of a drone versus a ground rig, and this is specifically targeted for white mold. And Damon's crew went out there and did a bunch of white mold ratings in these fields. And what we saw generally was very similar disease control or efficacy between a white mold application for a drone and at 2 gallons per acre, and a land application or land rig at about 20 gallons per acre. So that's good to see. We pulled some yield data and very similar yields as well. So stay tuned for Damon and I's work for 2024. And again, this was funded by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. And I also want to give a shout out to Eric Birschbach, a member of WAPAC. They've been really helpful in finding farmers locally for us to go out and put these trials out with. I guess finally, to give time for Damon to fix all my mistakes here. For the most part, wheat yields were better than I expected. I expected them to be lower, and test rates were low as I expected. And then again, given the precipitation and weather, I guess the disease incidents were kind of right on par. Cover crops presented a new and different challenge in 2024, but I think this is just something that as a community, we're moving into these cover crops. There's obviously going to be some challenges, and it makes management maybe more difficult. But as we saw there, we're able to build some carbon in those fields, which will help us specifically with not just putting carbon back into the soil, but the resiliency of our systems going forward as we get into some of these more of irregular weather patterns, which is a cool thing to make our fields more resilient and our crop yields probably more stable going forward in these cover crop systems. So as everything, there's positives and negatives with everything that we employ in a farming operation. Lastly, in terms of soybean yield, what we're thinking here, we actually had a lot of thin soybean stands and a slow start. But at this point, I'm looking forward specifically after Ed's talk about projected weather for the rest of July and August. I'm expecting average to above average yields are still attainable. Obviously, we're discounting those parts of the fields that aren't flooded out and dead. So maybe on a per acre basis, our yields will be down, but I think those fields that either well drained or didn't have a lot of drowned spots will be performing pretty well. So with that, there's my website and my Twitter handle. I'm going to pass this over to Damon for him to get started next.
The question line is a little bit empty at the moment, but I guess I have a question, I think, for Shawn and one for Damon. And looking at next year's cropping decisions, Shawn, are there some tools or some things we can be thinking about to predict some of these risks that farmers had this year? You brought up some risk of slug feeding, millipedes, maybe even soil management, whether it's tillage or cover crops. Are there some things we can be looking at or thinking about this fall, to help us prepare for next year? I know we're trying to balance that sustainability of using some of these soil health practices and balancing some of our pesticide use. How can we start setting ourselves up maybe for a better year next year?
Yeah, that's a good question, Josh. And I don't really have the best answer for you because I guess it just depends on, where farmers are in implementing these cover crops. We've got cover croppers that have been working on this for, 15, 20 years. They pretty much know what they're doing. They kind of have a system on how to handle the residue. I think the biggest challenge we run into now and have over the last 5 to 10 years is how do we deal with all this corn residue? Not is really the biggest challenge that we have. We're really not trying to promote additional tillage or trying to keep soil in place. Specifically now that we get these large or extreme rain events that we've seen this year. I mean, specifically, you're down there in, I think you're in Rock County now, Josh, but I mean, there's these big rain events where you get 2 to 3 inches in a half an hour. And if we have open fields, even tilled field, even no-till fields have a challenge handling that much rainfall, especially now how saturated they are. We're getting that water moving off. So I think, implementing these cover crops kind of help to hold the residue, help hold the water in the fields specifically. So I think this is something that as a larger ag community, we need to kind of look forward to and understand that the variability in a cover crop system is probably going to be greater than not. We're just adding another layer of complexity, and that's something farmers have to understand and be able to work towards. And this comes into machinery in terms of planter setup. Unfortunately, there's no slug baits that are labeled for Wisconsin. Those basically every I'm sure I'll be getting calls this year to go and try to get a Section 14, Section 2C, an emergency exemption for the slug baits. Trouble is, those are really hard to get because the label was kind of lapsed for west of Indiana. So Illinois, Wisconsin, west, that we basically just don't have labels for those. So that's going to be a challenge. However, maybe this is something we kind of go talk to the registrants for. If we're going to get into these, where we're going to be putting more cover crops into our cropping systems further west of Indiana, this is something that we would have to kind of look at getting those. Again, those aren't 100%. They have their variability in them as well, Josh. I guess a good compromise that we've seen has been strip tillage. I think that has been a very good tool farmers have implemented. However, there is a pretty substantial upfront cost in terms of upgrading equipment. You generally need a higher horsepower tractor to be able to, utilize that strip till with or without, depending on how you're deep banding fertilizer. So there's a lot of caveats in there, but I think just understanding that if we're going to be promoting cover crops, we're going to want to remain no-till or minimum till with strip till. We're going to have to figure out how these complexities are, and in my opinion, reward farmers who have been, implementing these practices. And that's more of I don't want to, sound like a communist here, but I think there's some societal benefits that farmers need to be able to be rewarded for. So we'll have to figure that one out. But that's someone smarter than me in terms of on the economic side of things to be able to figure out those tweaking government programs. So that's all I got.
No, thank you, Shawn.